this conversation, if that's okay with you. Yep. Okay, we're recording. So welcome to Heavy Chef, and great to meet you. I have actually just read your book, which which is now, it's about 12, I think it's 12, 13 years old now. It's certainly stood the test of time. And the first question I have for you is, I mean, how surprised have you been by the momentum and the movement that the book has created?
Amazed. So we worked very hard on the book for several years. In some ways you could count it was 6 or 7 years. We worked very intensely on the words of the book for about 3 years. And we had no expectation that it would catch on as it did. And it seems to be growing over time. So given the challenges of COVID-19 and worldwide poverty, recently India created a nudge unit, which is an ambitious effort to protect public health and to protect sex equality, actually. And to see all of this all over the world, to see the kind of creativity and determination that people are using to deploy nudge strategies, neither I nor Thaler, my co-author, anticipated anything like this.
I mean, it's incredible. And I think in terms of where we're sitting right now, I mean, the world has just absolutely gone nuts. You know, we have, unprecedented, certainly in our generation, times. And it feels like you mentioned it took you some time to come up with these words and these terms like nudge and libertarian paternalism and choice architecture. How can you weave in the choice architecture to foster a better outcome in terms of the interaction between the people within those units? And I'm sort of talking to small businesses more than the huge businesses, because that's who we serve. That's the community that we serve.
Great. So I'll give you a tiny example that it's almost like a short story that has large implications, yes. I think. So a few years ago, there was an interest at a large-ish entity, not a huge business, but large-ish, in saving paper. And the goal was partly to be environmentally better and also to save money because they were spending a lot on paper. So they tried two approaches. One was to educate people about the importance of not wasting paper for the environment and for money. And the other was to automatically change all the printers to double-sided default, though you could change it if you wanted to single-sided. The result was the moral suasion, the emphasis on saving paper had zero effect, none. But the double-sided default had a major effect. It really saved money and was environmentally better. Now, both were nudges, and it turned out that switching from single-sided default to double-sided default was a much more effective nudge. Small companies are engaged in choice architecture all the time, both with their own employees and with their customers. That if you're a small company with employees, you can have an architecture, let's say, that is full of paperwork and forms. We call it sludge, rhymes with nudge. And often the cumulative effect of paperwork and forms and administrative burdens is to sap morale in small companies. And little businesses can have sludge audits, this is just an example, by which they kind of have a catalog. It can be informal, just talking to people. It can involve finding out how much time do people spend on this stuff. And then the commitment is we are going to cut the sludge by 50% in the next month. That makes everybody smile and it increases productivity. Another thing you can do if you're dealing with customers is to emphasize through reminders, that's a nudge, or through warnings, that's a nudge, or through simplification, that's a nudge. things that can make customers' experience with a little company better. So there are little companies, right around where I live that may be restaurants, they may be little companies that fix cars, they may be food providers, heavy or not so heavy chefs. And the ones that do well often use communications that make people smile, that give people a little bit of information about what's available and why it's in your interest to use what's available. And that can grow a little business. It can make it turn into a mid-size and in some cases a big-size business. And it might be, emphasizing what most customers are doing. That's a nudge that can generate more sales. Or it may be just something that makes an experience easy rather than difficult. It turns out that something that takes 1 minute rather than 4 minutes can matter much more than those 3 minutes, because it lifts up people's thought that this is an enterprise that I like interacting with. And little companies all over the world, really, consistent with what you're saying, are using the toolbox of choice architecture. I've given some examples: reminders, warnings, information disclosure, simplification, to make their own employees enjoy their experience a bit better and to increase their customer base.
And you're seeing the choice architecture and the nudges start to become absolutely ubiquitous in, I mean, I come from a digital background where, I used to work in, I used to run a digital agency. And so we deployed the default choices in terms of, if you give 3 choices, make it the one that you really want as the default and that sort of thing. And it's rife in user interfaces in the way that the user experiences are designed now. You mentioned something which I think just struck a chord with me. The fact that India now are having, they've got their nudge forum and so on. And in South Africa, we are experiencing a significant increase in in some pretty not so savory trends. So, for example, we have gender-based violence is a big problem, and the lockdown has really exacerbated that. Can you give some examples from a behavior architecture in terms of how that's working? Say, for example, the Indian forum. What sort of techniques and tactics are they deploying to encourage and foster better behavior?
Okay, so in India, here's somewhere between moderately and spectacularly successful initiative. It's a little, has a slightly unpleasant feature, if you'll permit. Problem is open defecation, which is a public health problem in India and has long been. And the policy, which has been very fierce in a good way, has been to address that so people use toilets. Now, main impetus is about public health, but an also important impetus is that when girls and women do what is being prevented through the use of toilets, they are vulnerable because it's often at night to assault and rape. And what the policy toward healthier use, let's say, of technology, toilets, what the policy has done is been to promote public health and to reduce sexual violence. And it's an architectural solution where an 18-year-old or 16-year-old isn't walking out at night by herself. She's just going to the toilet. And the authorities there, who have used nudges in the form of emphasizing social norms, connecting with the cultural resonance that Gandhi has. Gandhi believed in cleanliness. Using reminders and role models. These are all nudges. What they've done is to both promote public health and to reduce sexual violence. Now, the lesson there for any nation that's experiencing an outgrowth is to use, if you can, something like an architecture where people who are in places that are vulnerable to sexual violence aren't going to be in those places anymore. That doesn't seem to be responsive to what you've described in South Africa. So to use cultural norms that are good ones and ones worth honoring and lifting up as a safeguard, and to use either cultural figures who have taken a strong stand against sexual violence to give a sense that those who engage in, hurting or hitting women are acting inconsistently with their own deepest values, to suggest that there is an increasing norm that is widely shared, including in the communities that have a significant problem. Still, there's an increasing norm of working to counteract that problem. Through communications of that sort, you can reduce the incidence. So I'll give you a little example from Saudi Arabia, where the tradition has been that women who are wives can't work outside of the home unless their husbands say so. And the experiment found that young men in Saudi Arabia actually are very comfortable with their wives working outside of the home. But they didn't know that other young men think that. And that is the majority view. When they were told that actually your view, which is it's okay, is widely shared, then among those young men and those families, and there's a large population who were tested, the number of women who started working outside of the home skyrocketed because they got permission from their husband. And the reason they got their husband is their husband was informed that that's the social norm. So that's an opportunity. Even if the problem of domestic violence is widespread, it's highly likely that the vast majority of men think it's wrong, including, I would guess, the vast majority of men who have engaged in domestic violence would say in a private moment, I agree it's wrong. And that's something that can be publicized and brought to bear. I'd love it if the movement to reduce, and it's to be hoped close to eliminate domestic violence, that would be, an extraordinary achievement, were connected with some of South Africa's own deepest values, what the attack on apartheid was about. And I was there during the transition from an apartheid regime. I was there with Albie Sachs and others during the Albie Sachs, a great friend and hero, Arthur Chastleton also.
Amazing.
Yeah,
Albie's been on Heavy Chef as well. He's such a beautiful human being.
Completely. And part of what the liberation fight was about was that no group is going to be systematically subordinated to another. And one way that happens is through violence, including sexual violence.
This is powerful stuff, Professor Cass. You're talking about, and there's so much, and I know we're limited for time, but there's so many questions in all of this, and one that I just want to touch upon, and maybe this is quite a tricky subject to broach, but it's a thing of, it's powerful stuff, but it is a thing of power. So just the thing of libertarian paternalism, there's a sort of paternal role that you have to play, which it makes the assumption that the general leaning is to the good, right? But it can also be to the bad. We've seen in history where similar kind of techniques and tactics of behavioral economics have been applied, and just through some simple nudges have been remarkably successful in leading entire populations to do really bad things, right? How do we ensure, it's almost like, how do we ensure that this doesn't get, into the wrong hands, because it could, how do you safeguard against these remarkably powerful tactics, which seem, by the way, to be deployed in your current, in government at the moment, to an extent?
Okay, so that's a great question. Thank you. If you look at the tools a government has, and then there are tools that companies have. The government has criminal penalties, it has jail, it has taxes, it has fines, it has subsidies, and it has nudges. Of these, and this is almost a biblical way of putting it, of these, the nudges are the weakest in a good way because they preserve freedom of choice. So if what you do is automatically people are enrolled in, let's say, a pension program, so they're going to save a little more money. But let's say they don't have much money. They don't want to be in the pension program. If it's a nudge, they can opt out really easily. That's the whole point of nudging. If we're dealing with a problem, a health problem, let's say of obesity, a nudge would maintain freedom of choice, and it might be a calorie label, or it might be a campaign of some sort to reduce consumption of, let's say, full sugar, full calorie beverages. And those things, if you want to drink the full sugar, full calorie, you're allowed. So there's a built-in safety valve against coercion and horror built into the nudges. Nonetheless, your point is right that nudges can be very powerful. If people are automatically presumed, let's say, to be of a particular religion, or automatically presumed to vote for a certain candidate unless they say no, that's a violation of religious liberty in the first case and political liberty in the second case. So we need two things. We need democratic safeguards against nudges. And when I was in the US government, everything we did was subject to public scrutiny and review, and in some cases, public comments on our proposals suggested we weren't going in the right direction. I hope not because of malevolence, and I believe not because of malevolence, but in some cases we just didn't understand the problem well enough. So our nudge was not great. But in addition to democratic safeguards, we need a Bill of Rights for nudging. And I've done work, surveys in 17 countries. I think South Africa isn't yet on the list, but we have data from Germany, France, Italy, Russia, China, South Korea. We may have recently gotten data from South Africa. It's a large research project. And basically, we uncover all over the world that people have shared judgments in very different countries about which nudges are acceptable and which aren't. And if you violate religious liberty by presuming people are of a certain, they're Protestants by default, people don't like that. If they're presumed to be of a certain political party, people don't like that either. Majorities are strongly against that. If you manipulate people, let's say you have a subliminal advertisement in the movie theater that the government requires to combat obesity, people don't like that, even though they like the end. So some ideas that are in the South African Constitution are very well tailored to protecting against the risks associated, let's say, with incompetent or self-serving or malevolent nudging.
For sure. So I think then, with that in mind, and last question for you, Prof Sunstein, I want to talk about education, and particularly the education of entrepreneurs themselves. We're an entrepreneur education platform, and I can't help but notice, particularly during the crisis and the pandemic, everybody's jumping online. There just seems to be this absolute conveyor belt, and it's a conveyor belt that's increasing speed every single day, with more and more stuff that you're being bombarded with. And as an entrepreneur, and as anybody who's trying to navigate their learning pathway of how to take on board which information is more relevant to me, how can we do better? How can we create an architecture? And you being an academic for some time, how do we tailor learning for not just entrepreneurs, but I'm particularly interested in entrepreneurs, that is just more relevant and resonant to the individuals, as opposed to just seeing so much out there?
For information, often the best slogan to keep in mind is less is more. So those who provide information, including website designers and educators and people in business, they think that the range of things they have to tell people is the right range of things, but it's often completely overwhelming because the recipient of the information has more things on her or his mind than the provider of the information, who finds this familiar and is basically focused on that thing. So to turn things into very simple, actionable instruction is often the right way to go. In the US government, we had a food advisory icon called the food pyramid, where there's a person marching to the top of a pyramid, and there are these bands underneath the pyramid that are supposed to connote fruits and vegetables and meats and dairy. And it's a complete mess. There's information overload. So we got rid of that and turned it into a food plate, which is basically, it says make half your plate of fruits and vegetables. It's really simple. And to think of plate approaches rather than pyramid approaches to the problems entrepreneurs face is probably a big step forward. Often the problem that entrepreneurs face is not that they disagree with the advice or information they're being given, but that they can't figure it out. And so resistance to, let's say, helpful suggestion is often a product of confusion rather than rejection. And so to move things in the direction of 20% simpler at least than the status quo is usually a way of solving the information overload problem.
That's a super helpful answer. Thank you, sir. And I think it speaks to the fact that as entrepreneurs, we already have so much, we have so much on our plate, so to speak. And I think to remove at least 20% of that it'll only gain their favor. So Professor Sunstein, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And we are really genuinely looking forward to the conversation that we're going to be having with you in July. And long may this success continue. It's been such an amazing thing to watch how just a short book like this has sparked such an amazing movement. So well done on that. Congratulations, sir. And I look forward to engaging with you again.
Thank you. Great pleasure to talk.
I want to talk about just a little bit left field in terms of, oh, no. Sorry, have I still got you there? I just lost you.
You're good. No, I'm still here.
Okay, a phone call has just bypassed my do not disturb sign. That's quite strange. But hang on one second. Let me just see if I can get you back on my screen. There we go. My question is, and this is the last question for you, Prof Sunstein.